In 2013, I told my parents I was going to have a career in psychedelics, and they said, "You mean you want to be a drug dealer?" In 2017, when I started working as a night attendant for MDMA-assisted therapy studies for PTSD, they still didn't quite get it. When Naropa University hired me to be their psychedelic-assisted therapies program coordinator in 2021, they started to get on board, but were still kind of cold. When I began working as a psilocybin facilitator full-time in 2023, things started to click for them. And now that I'm Colorado's first fully licensed natural medicine clinical facilitator, they're fully on board. They get it. That arc from "so you want to be a drug dealer" to "this is legitimate medicine" isn't just my story. It mirrors the story of our culture's own relationship to psychedelics. My story falls within a larger context that highlights really how psychedelics went from something that could get you arrested to something that you could build a career on. And how that happened wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, decades-long campaign to undo one of the most destructive, terrible policy decisions in all of American history. Most people assume that psychedelic therapy is sort of a new idea, and it's just not. It's really a rediscovery. Psilocybin, of course, was used by pre-Columbian and Mesoamerican peoples at least 3,000 years ago, maybe 7,000 years ago. And in the United States, even here, from the 1950s to the mid-1960s, psychedelics were a legitimate area of psychiatric research and practice. That period, from the 1950s to the mid-1960s, there were more than 1,000 clinical papers published on psychedelic research and therapy. Over 40,000 people legally received psychedelics in the United States. There were tons of books, conferences. It was a big part of psychiatry, psychology. During that time, LSD was distributed to interested professionals freely by its manufacturer, Sandoz. You could just write a letter to Sandoz, tell them you were wanted to study LSD for professional purposes, and they would send you vials of what they called Delicid. It was LSD 25, and they actively recommended it as an aid to psychiatry, as an aid to therapy. It wasn't fringe science at all. It was really mainstream. It was a big deal. And we called this the pre-prohibition era of psychedelic research. Then in 1970, Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, and it all changed. LSD and psilocybin were placed in Schedule I, which is the most restrictive category. It's reserved for drugs that have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, which we now know is just absurd. To put LSD or psilocybin in that category, cannabis is still Schedule I, by the way, even though we know it has all kinds of uses. It's really clear that the DEA's classification of these substances is not a scientific decision. Nixon's own domestic policy advisor, a man named John Ehrlichman, has one of the most damning quotes that describes the positionality of the Nixon administration at that time. He basically says that the Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. They knew they couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by criminalizing psychedelics, by criminalizing the drugs that were associated with their enemies, they could vilify them night after night in the evening news. They could break up their meetings. They could arrest their leaders. The quote of Ehrlichman, which maybe I'll put up here on the screen, goes, "Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So the scheduling had nothing to do with the clinical evidence or scientific evidence. It had everything to do with political manipulation. 1,000 studies, and it didn't matter. Didn't make a bit of difference to the government. The result of that was a research, but not necessarily practice, blackout that lasted for decades. Studying psychedelics in any legitimate way in the United States became career suicide. Funding disappeared for aspiring researchers, and an entire field of inquiry, legitimate, genuine inquiry, was totally frozen. If you look at a graph, which I may put up here, of psychedelic publications year by year, you can see it. There's a peak in the 1960s, and then Nixon, and then there's this valley of prohibition that lasts like 30 years. All of that time totally lost. All of those people who could have been helped over those decades denied meaningful help because political manipulation, really an awful thing. But fortunately, the work never completely stopped. Underground practitioners continued, despite it being illegal. International researchers kept publishing, and there were LSD studies out of Switzerland and other countries. And there was one person in particular who was really dedicated to fighting the system. In 1986, Rick Doblin founded an organization called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. If you're listening to this right now, it's likely that you already know about MAPS, so I won't spend a ton of time exploring them. I'll just say a couple things about them. The year prior to MAPS founding in 1985, the DEA moved to schedule MDMA, which previously had not been scheduled. MAPS, as it was initially formed, was a response to the DEA's decision to schedule MDMA. They called themselves a non-profit pharmaceutical company, and they were dedicated, devoted, created specifically to navigate MDMA through the FDA approval process. And it was a deliberate multi-decade bet. MAPS spent 37 years and raised over $140 million to move psychedelic research forward. Their strategy was pretty simple, but it was really incredibly stubborn. Work within existing regulatory frameworks, fund rigorous clinical trials, and build the kind of evidence base that regulators just can't ignore. Their efforts to get MDMA approved for PTSD treatment haven't yet been successful, although they almost were, but they were shot down by an FDA advisory committee. Still, though, MAPS is the organization probably most responsible for moving the needle on psychedelic research and policy and getting us through that valley of prohibition. MAPS is like the icebreaker ship that cleared the space where lots of other people now. There were essentially three things that worked together in harmony to shift psychedelics from the fringe, criminal edges of culture to mainstream science. They were scientific credibility, alignment with sympathetic narratives, and cultural normalization. So, scientific credibility. MAPS kicked off things with MDMA research by securing investigational new drug permit from the FDA in 2001, which was one of the lips on modern psychedelic research, predated only by Strassman's research into DMT in the 1990s. Then in 2016, Johns Hopkins and NYU published landmark clinical trials on the same day in the same journal about psilocybin. They demonstrated that a single dose of psilocybin could produce substantial and sustained reductions in depression and anxiety in cancer patients, which was huge at the time. Imperial College of London followed shortly after that with another groundbreaking psilocybin study on treatment-resistant depression. These weren't small studies with loose methodology. They were really rigorous, really well-done pieces of research from world-class institutions that were published in top-tier journals. We know when Johns Hopkins puts its name on something, people take it seriously. It sends a message to the entire field that this is genuine, this is legitimate. And that institutional adoption and institutional legitimacy has done a lot for the field of psychedelics. By 2019, both the Imperial College of London and Johns Hopkins had opened dedicated psychedelic research centers. And today, the list of universities that have psychedelic research centers has only grown massively. It includes places like the University of California, San Francisco, Yale, Mount Sinai, Harvard, and even the University of Colorado Anschutz has one of the largest psilocybin trials on existential distress in cancer patients that's happened anywhere in the world. It's pretty exciting. So the institutional legitimacy argument is pretty much over. There's no more debate. It is kind of a curious thing, though, how the institutions that for the decades of prohibition were complicit, actively complicit in repeating terrible narratives about psychedelics, now are positioning themselves as authorities on psychedelics. It's great to see academic research, but I can't help but feel a sense of loss. And where was science? Where were the advocates? Why were academic institutions so on board with the war on drugs? Okay, now, as I say it, I realize the answer to that comes from where they get their funding. Universities have to align with federal policy in order to continue receiving funding. But it's just disappointing. It's really disappointing that the institutions that we look to for truth would sacrifice truth on the altar of getting funded. So the second thing that helped shift the psychedelic narrative was conscious and intentional alignment with sympathetic narratives like veteran stories. For example, I have a friend named James. James was a combat medic in Afghanistan who came home with really debilitating PTSD. He, fortunately, became a participant in one of the first waves of MAPS MDMA therapy trials for PTSD. And it totally turned his life around. He got his life back, is what happened. After that experience, James enrolled in CU Boulder, where he founded the Psychedelic Club. Psychedelic Club was a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to changing the cultural narrative on psychedelics. We sought to fertilize the cultural soil so that seeds of psychedelic policy and psychedelic change could grow. And we did that through lots and lots of events and conversations and community organizing. We didn't promote drug use. We shared stories like James, and we normalized a conversation that desperately needed normalizing. I came after James as president of the Psychedelic Club, and I helped grow the organization from 8 chapters to 30 across the country. I'm really proud of that. James was just one of many, actually, veterans from Iraq, from Afghanistan, who came back from decades of prior conflict and started telling stories of really profound healing that they experienced from psychedelics. And those stories that were told by veterans landed in the cultural mind really differently than any research paper really could. Veterans occupy a politically protected space in American culture. If you're opposed to researching psychedelics for PTSD, you're effectively opposing help for veterans. And that's not a position that very few politicians wanted to occupy. MAPS and the larger psychedelic movement sort of recognized that and used it as a narrative lever. They intentionally shifted the story from psychedelics are hippie drugs to psychedelics represent help, meaningful, deep help for some of the most deserving people in the culture. The third factor that helped create modern day psychedelic revival is what I'll call cultural normalization. By the time cannabis was legalized in Colorado in 2012, it was already a massive part of the culture here. If you were walking on the street, you could see people smoking. People talked about it. It was common to know people who smoked, to smoke cannabis yourself, to see it everywhere. It wasn't some hidden, stigmatized thing. It was a part of Colorado culture. Psychedelics followed a really similar path, actually. Even prior to decriminalization and legalization, we had psychedelic clubs in every major city and university. There were public events, film screenings, speaker series, community gatherings, indigenous elders from all over the world that would come and serve ceremony here in Colorado. There was a giant ecosystem around psychedelics in Colorado prior to the passage of any of the laws that made psychedelics feel familiar rather than frightening. So policy didn't lead culture. It wasn't that we passed the law and then people started using and working with psychedelics. It was that people were using and working with psychedelics already, and policy followed suit. So policy held the leash of culture. And as a direct result of all of these things, of those three forces, activists, advocates, researchers, people who've just been interested in psychedelics and been honest about that interest, Colorado passed one of the most progressive, forward-looking and thinking pieces of psychedelic policy that is yet to be passed in the United States. The city of Denver was actually the first city to decriminalize psilocybin in 2019, and the whole state followed shortly after that, when in 2022, Colorado passed their Natural Medicine Health Act, or Proposition 122. This created a statewide framework with two parallel pathways for the use and the working with of natural medicine, decriminalization and legalization. And they're not exactly the same thing. Decriminalization is just the removal of criminal penalties. As it relates to natural medicine in Colorado, this includes the personal growing, sharing, and use of psilocybin, DMT-containing plants, mescaline-containing plants, except peyote, and iboga by anybody 21 and over. It protects personal freedom and traditional ceremonial use without creating a commercial context. So in the personal use model, money is not supposed to be exchanged for natural medicines. It does happen in practice, but it's not supposed to be the way that it goes. Then we have legalization. So the legalization arm of the Natural Medicine Health Act created an entire regulatory landscape, a system with licensed facilitators, healing centers, cultivators, product manufacturers, a testing facility. This is the ecosystem within which I work. It requires training, licensure, a lot of paperwork, ongoing consultation, compliance. A lot of people have complaints or challenges with the regulated model, and as I'll get to soon, it's not a perfect model, but it is kind of amazing that we have a legal pathway for psychedelic practice in Colorado. For that reason alone, I think it really justifies all of the hoops that we have to jump through in the regulated model. I hold literally the first natural medicine clinical facilitator license issued in Colorado. I'm recording this video on April 14th of 2026. So as of right now, this whole regulated model has only been around for a year and some change. It's brand new. It's important to note that these two tracks, the personal use track and the legalization track, the decriminalization and the legalization track, the personal use and the regulated track, they're not necessarily competing. They serve different needs and really different populations. Clinical practitioners learn a lot from ceremonial practitioners and actually still have a lot to learn from the depth of relationship that is supported in ceremonial and community settings. And ceremonial practitioners have some things to learn from clinical practitioners, like how to keep people safe, how to screen, and how to assess. They're fundamentally different settings. Imagine the difference between a psychedelic therapy clinic and an all-night ayahuasca or psilocybin prayer ceremony. They're for different kinds of people, for different uses, and both are equally legitimate. Some people feel really comfortable in a clinical office. Other people don't want to be there at all. They feel more at home in a ceremonial container with songs and maybe a fire in the middle. And we in the regulated model actually owe a lot to ceremonial practitioners, to the personal use world, to the underground psychedelic therapists who kept this work alive through the dark days of prohibition. Now, I really don't want to pretend, not that you're getting this sense, I know that I've already communicated this, but again, I don't want to pretend that it's all smooth, that it's all easy. Colorado and Oregon right now are the only two states that have regulated models like this. New Mexico is working on a regulated model and they've passed the law for it, but they haven't yet implemented the model. They're not yet issuing licenses. So that leaves Colorado and Oregon as the only two places in the United States that have a regulated natural medicine model. And in both places, we're experiencing some growing pains, some challenges. So far, in the regulated world, we've seen really high operational costs. We've seen healing centers close. We've seen supply-demand imbalances with seemingly more facilitators than there are people who want psilocybin services. About a third of Oregon's regulated psilocybin healing centers have already closed down since they started their model in 2023. And it's true that these are the challenges that a new disruptive industry faces. But I think there are some other factors that are creating challenges that are not necessary or that we still have to overcome. The biggest one is accessibility. A lot of people simply can't afford to do this work. And the fees, the training, the licensure that are faced by people working in the regulated model often force us to charge more than many people can afford to pay in order to pay back what we spent to get trained and educated just to work in this model. So that's a bit of a dilemma. It's hard too, because the clinical promise and the efficacy is established, the regulatory infrastructure exists, and the question now is whether economics can actually sustain this beautiful thing that we have happening in Oregon and Colorado, and whether we can get access to the people who need this the most. So that's the story. That's how psychedelics went from ancient ceremonial use to mainstream psychiatry over the last 50 years, or from political suppression and blackout to a deliberate campaign of scientific credibility, alignment with veteran narratives, and the process of cultural normalization. And finally, today, to a regulated licensed industry. I told you at the beginning of this video that my parents went from, so you want to be a drug dealer, to totally being on board with what it is that I'm doing with my life. That happened primarily because the culture shifted around them. It didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't because of a single study or a single story. It wasn't even my own story. My own stories of psychedelics in the early days to my parents felt like insane drivel. It was the arising of cultural approval, legitimacy, the production of all kinds of media, and a strong presence of psychedelics in the cultural mainstream that finally shifted my parents' perspective. It happened because enough people who were legitimate and respected, researchers, veterans, advocates, underground practitioners, to some degree policy advocates, were persistent enough to move the needle on this project. And it's still continuing. The work isn't really over. This whole field of psychedelic therapy and research only exists because people refuse to let prohibition be the last word. They simply didn't let terrible science and even worse policy win. And that work isn't done. The accessibility challenges, the pharmaceutical pressures, the equity issues, all of those things are still in front of us. But so is the most promising development in mental health in decades. And for the first time in 50 years, we're finally allowed to pursue this, which I think is one of the most exciting things happening in the world right now. We know that we could use some hopeful news. Thank you for watching.